Hey, how's it going? Parker Walbeck here, and welcome to day one of the Filmmaking Challenge. Today, we're going to be covering some pretty basic stuff, but I'd say 90% of people who own cameras don't fully understand these basics, which leads to unprofessional results. So even if you think you have a grasp on these, pay attention, you just might learn something new. So for day one, we're going to be covering 5 steps to getting your camera settings dialed in and ready to deliver great results right out of the box. Step number 1 is your picture profile. Now, this one depends on your camera of choice. If you're using a smartphone, the picture profile is already set. If you're using a Sony or Panasonic camera, the menus and wording will be slightly different, but because Canon is the most popular brand for video cameras, I'll be showing you how to do all these camera settings using a Canon SL2. If you have a different brand of camera, don't freak out. Some of these settings will be in different places, but same principles will apply. So first things first, make sure your camera is switched to the manual video mode. Next, come into your menu, shooting settings, and picture style. Your camera will have a few presets that you can choose from. Feel free to try any of these out and decide which one you like. I personally like to create a custom profile by clicking the info button, choosing standard, then bringing my sharpness all the way down to 0, my contrast down 2, and then I leave the other 2 at 0. This will give you a natural, vibrant look to your footage straight out of camera and shouldn't require much color correction in post. Now, if you want to preserve a little more of that dynamic range and you enjoy the color correcting process, then feel free to shoot in a flatter profile, but for beginners, I recommend the settings I just shared. Step number 2 is to set your white balance. We're not going to get into this too technically, but basically the goal with setting your white balance is to make your whites look white. So find something white in your shot and then toggle between the different white balance presets until your whites look white and the colors look balanced, meaning not too blue and not too orange. If you're shooting in direct sunlight outside or by a window inside with sunlight coming in the windows, you would switch to the daylight preset and that would give you a correct white balance at around 5200 to 5600 Kelvin. Or if you're indoors being lit by artificial lights only, you'll probably be using the tungsten or fluorescent setting depending on the lights, which will give you a reading between 3000 Kelvin to 4000 Kelvin. Now, nicer cameras allow you to manually choose the exact color temperature, but you'll be able to get by in most lighting situations by just using these presets. Just make sure to set your white balance for each new room or environment you go into because the light color can change a lot from room to room or from going from inside to outside. If this seems a little too confusing to you and you're having a hard time figuring out which white balance to pick, you can always set your white balance to auto. This means the camera will guess what color balance is best for the lighting setting you're in. Now, it doesn't always guess perfectly. That's why I recommend learning how to set this manually. But for the rookies who haven't learned this well yet, you can usually get by with just auto. Just be aware that in auto mode, the colors may shift during the shot as your camera continually analyzes the image to prescribe what it thinks is the correct white balance. Step number 3 is to set your resolution and frame rate. 1920 by 1080 is the minimum resolution I'd recommend shooting in. Anything lower is too low of quality. 4K is quickly becoming more widely used and is what I typically shoot in, but most people watch content from their phones that only have 1080p screens anyway, so 1080 is a great place to start. 4K I'd say is ideal, but be aware it will take up a lot more space on your computer and will be harder to edit. Now, this number next to the resolution means frames per second, or how many still images it takes every second. The traditional cinematic frame rate that you'll see in Hollywood movies is 24 frames per second, so I always shoot at 24 frames per second. Shooting at 30 frames per second will give you more of a home video or news broadcast look, so if you're going for that look, that's the setting you'd use. And then I use 60 frames per second for when I want slow motion, and then convert that 60 frames per second down to 24 frames per second in post, which creates slow motion. And we'll show you how to do that in the editing video, but anytime I'm filming people talk, like right now, I film at 24 frames per second. And anytime I'm filming B-roll shots of products or things that I'm talking about, I usually shoot that at 60 frames per second so I can slow it down in post, which makes my movements look smoother. Step number 4 is to get the exposure set correctly. Exposure means the brightness of your image and is controlled by 3 different settings in your camera: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Without going too much into detail, I'll explain what each of these does. Shutter speed is your number on the far bottom left part of the screen, and this controls motion blur. The lower the number, the blurrier the motion in your image will be, and the more light it lets in. And the higher the number, the less blurry the motion gets, and the less light it lets into your camera. As a general rule of filmmaking, you want to keep your shutter speed double your frame rate. So when shooting at 24 frames per second, you'd want to shoot at 1/50th of a shutter speed. The aperture is the number in the middle here, and it controls depth of field, or how much background blur you can get. The lower the number, the more background blur you'll get, and the brighter the image will get. And the higher the number, the more your image will be in focus, and the darker your image will get. I usually like to shoot at lower apertures to get that nice background blur. And lastly, your ISO controls image quality. So the lower the number, the higher the quality of the image will be, and the higher the number, the noisier and lower quality the image will be. But as it gets higher, it will brighten up the image, though it is doing this artificially, which increases the amount of noise. So I try and keep my ISO around 100 or usually as low as possible, but sometimes you do have to raise it up when there's not enough light in the situation you're filming in. So these three settings, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, all work together to determine your exposure. And you usually have a couple tools within your camera that will help you know if your image is too bright or too dark. The most basic tool that most cameras will have is called a histogram, which you can pull up by pushing the info button. The histogram will show you if your image is too dark when this white information is all on the left side, and it will tell you that your image is too bright when this white information creeps up to the right side. You want to try and keep all that white information from touching either side if possible, and that will help you know that your image is correctly exposed. So on a typical day filming, I'll usually keep my aperture and ISO as low as they go. Like for instance, what you're seeing here, I'm shooting at a 1.4 aperture and 100 ISO, and then I just adjust my shutter speed according to the amount of light until my exposure looks correct. In this case, I'm shooting at 1/50th of a shutter speed to keep that double my frame rate rule. But if I were to take this camera outside, it would get super overexposed and I would bring down my shutter speed until the image was exposed correctly. Now, bumping up the shutter speed past double the frame rate goes against the rule I just told you, but in a pinch, going quickly between drastically changing exposures, this may be your quickest option to still maintain a shallow depth of field. But if time permits, I'd recommend picking up an ND filter when going into bright locations so that you can knock down the amount of light entering into your camera, which will allow you to keep your aperture low for shallow depth of field and also keep your shutter speed low for that nice cinematic motion blur. So if your budget allows, you can go pick up an ND filter for pretty cheap on Amazon, or the ones I use, which are a bit more expensive, are Polar Pro, but they're going to be a lot higher quality glass. Again, if this is all too confusing to the beginners, you can turn your camera to auto exposure, which means the camera will guess how bright to make your image. But again, it doesn't always guess correctly and will sometimes underexpose or overexpose and make your image look unprofessional. So I recommend learning how to set these manually if you're serious about getting professional images. Now, our fifth and final step is to set your focus. Again, this depends on your camera. Smartphones generally do a pretty good job with autofocus. Panasonic cameras don't do great at autofocus. Sony cameras do pretty well, and Canon is known for having the best autofocus in the market, and most of their newer cameras will have this awesome autofocus. So just test out your specific camera to see how the autofocus performs. But for a camera like the Canon SL2 or an M50 or any of the newer Canon cameras, I would say you're safe to use autofocus in most scenarios, which will ensure you get nice sharp images that are in focus all the time. And to set your autofocus, first make sure your lens is set to auto. Then in your camera, as long as you're filming just one person or one subject at a time, I'd recommend using the setting AF tracking, as this will follow the subject no matter where it goes in the shot, making sure it's in focus at all times. And if your camera doesn't have autofocus, or you're filming something where the subject is moving too fast to be able to track accurately, then you'll want to set your focus to manual, and then just make sure your subject stays the same distance from the camera at all times so they stay in focus. So with those 5 settings dialed in, you're ready to begin shooting and capturing some beautiful images. But having a decent camera and getting the settings right is only half the battle. The second half is creatively learning how to use the camera so that you can create cinematic images that look like the movies. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about how to get great composition and how to use camera angles to enhance your films. But before we move on to the next video, we've left a challenge for you below to help you apply what you learned today. Do not make the mistake of overloading yourself with too much knowledge without first mastering the things that you've already learned as you go. But that's it, guys, for camera settings. Stay tuned for more videos to come.